Well, welcome back, Grace Chapel friends and family. Welcome back to the Grace Chapel podcast.
Yep.
I'm Ben, and this is Paul, and we're sitting down to talking about our series, Generosity That Tells a Story. But this week, Paul, we got Thanksgiving coming up.
Yeah, it is.
What's this week going to look like for you?
Well, we're here for today, and then we're going to be heading off to spend some time with family, like many folks are. And so we're trying to get the podcast recorded before we head out of town. Really neat, actually, after just 2 episodes recorded at this point, that have had several folks come and say, "Hey, we've been tuning into the podcast. Are you going to be recording it before we head out of town? We'd love to listen to it on the way. Don't watch it if you're on YouTube. Just listen as you're driving."
Yes.
But yeah, it's exciting to us that we've got people connecting and tuning in. How about yourself as far as Thanksgiving is concerned?
That's awesome. I'm going to go see some family.
Excellent.
My dad's family out in Myrtle Beach, so I'll be heading out that way in just a couple days. So
yeah,
it'll be a
man,
fun time.
head to the beach. Any excuse, right, to get out that direction. For sure. Yeah,
it's always a good time. Taking a nice walk on the beach on a chilly November day. That's a good time.
There's something nice about it. Listen to the waves roll. Anytime you're out on the beach, even when it's cold, I agree. I'm definitely a beach guy, and so for me, we'll be actually headed to see my parents after Christmas down in Panama City, and it'll be the same thing. It's not going to be swimming weather, that's for sure. But to put on a jacket and just take a stroll on the beach is still just kind of this really invigorating thing. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
Gnarly.
Yep.
Well, cool, Paul. So tell us a little bit about yesterday. Yesterday we were in part 3 of our series, Generosity That Tells a Story.
Yeah.
So moving forward with that, tell us a little bit about what was that message about. If anyone missed it, just give us like a little bit of a summary.
Okay. So I'll try to give you a bigger picture if you missed this message, and maybe if you're just connecting with the series as well, how it ties in. So the whole, I think, maybe thesis, what I'm proposing in the series, and I think we know this to be true, is that the way we live, we all believe this, I think on some level, that by our actions, by the things we embrace, as people watch us, it communicates something to them. So the way we're framing that is to say that it communicates something. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it actually tells a story. So a story not necessarily with words, or not always with words, but by our actions, by our behaviors, by the lifestyle we choose to embrace. And so we can then, if we take that and take it a step further, by the way we live generously, tell a story about what we believe about the things we have, our finances, our time. We talked about yesterday in the sense of, we've got our time and our talent and our treasure. And how that tells a story. It's a narrative to those who are watching, what we believe about the things we have, our possessions, the things that, in a sense, we could say, we believe belong to us. Well, yesterday, I began with kind of the kind of silly and somewhat funny story of leaving here from the church building one day, and my wife had asked me to stop and pick up a few things on the way home. So I stopped at one of our local grocery stores, Kroger. If you're from this area, you're familiar with it. And I stopped at the Kroger and was coming out, had several bags balanced in my hands and holding them, how you do, just kind of like the death claw when you've got a number of bags you're carrying. And then comes that moment where you realize my keys are in my pocket, so I'm walking toward my truck, fumbling around with the bags.
Scene,
it is, classic scene. Balancing things. Of course, I'm super shopper, so or at least that's the facade I got to portray, right? Coming out toward my truck, and I get my keys out of my pocket, and with bags in this hand, I'm hitting the unlock button on the fob, and nothing's happening, and so I'm thinking, great, my battery's died, and so now I got to switch over. Because I had this plan in my mind, right? In perfect stride, I would hit the button. I would, with my pinky, reach over, unlatch the door.
We all know the plan. We know the plan.
So you've done this
been
too.
Been there, done it.
This is familiar. And so, so I, have that all planned out. With the pinky, I'm going to open the passenger side door, unload the groceries, swing around to the driver's side door, jump in, and ride off into the sunset. And that wasn't the way things worked out. So, I get over to the driver's side door now that my fob is not working, and I determine I'm going to use my key in the door, and then my key doesn't start working, and there's this moment where you just have this kind of uh-oh feeling. What's going on? Something's wrong here. And then, of course, you do the double take. You look down the side of your vehicle to determine that actually this car just looks like your car. So in my case, my white truck, so my white Toyota Tundra looked like someone else's white Toyota Tundra that was parked just one aisle over from mine, and realized pretty quickly this is not the truck that belongs to me. And I think we've all had that moment where we thought something that belonged to us didn't belong to us. Had several people share even funnier stories. One told me about coming out of the grocery store just a couple of months ago, and her husband was doing the drive-by, the drive around, looking for her as she would come and trying to time that perfectly. And so she got in the car thinking that it was her husband, who must have been a guy also waiting for his wife, and it was a similar car, and she got in the car and she looked over and realized, oh, not only is this not my car, this is not my husband either. And so we all, I think, have a funny story to share along those lines to some degree.
I know I've been there.
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable. Cars, there's only so many of the vehicles that we drive, and so at some point in time you're going to get those things crossed up.
Yeah.
And so kind of use that as just a way to preface or to lead us into thinking or understanding that there are times when we believe that something belongs to us, this is mine, and then we find out, we discover later it actually isn't. This wasn't mine. I thought this was mine. And sometimes that happens in funny or sort of even slightly ironic ways. But we use that just to kind of pave the way to this understanding that in reality, as we dig deeper, especially into Scripture, there are multiple places where God reveals to us that actually nothing we have ultimately belongs to us. We've been given it in trust. We're stewards of these things that God has given us. He's given us what He's given us so that we can bless others. I mean, this idea all the way back to even God calling Abraham, and He says to Abraham, I'll bless you. And this was something that didn't make it into the message yesterday, but this is often that way. You got 30 minutes to share an idea, and so this didn't make it in the message, but even from the beginning, as God is calling Abraham to establish a people, God tells Abraham, I will bless you. But why is He going to bless Abraham? I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. And so all throughout Scripture is woven this idea of the blessings that we have. We're given to be good stewards of those resources, whether again it's time, it's talent, it's treasure. We're given those things to steward well so that we can bless others and really point them to God. And so that's kind of where we set things, or kind of the journey that we set out on yesterday, that we're continuing today. Asking this question: what story am I telling others by the way that I use my time, my talent, my treasure?
Awesome. And you really focused in on this parable that Jesus shared. We often call it the parable of the talents, or bags of gold, or something of that nature. And it's Matthew
25. Yeah.
25. Thank you. And one of the things that I just found interesting in that, and if you're not familiar with this parable, it's just this story that Jesus it's this king, and he gives these bags of gold to these three different servants, and one is given 5 bags, another's given 2 bags, one's given 1 bag, and the guy with 5 bags goes and he makes 5 more bags by the time the king returns. The guy with 2 bags makes 2 more, and the guy with the 1 bag, he just buries his bag and doesn't really do anything with it.
Yeah.
And you made an interesting point with that. And you kind of talked about how this guy with the 1 bag kind of has something up on us at times, which I thought was interesting. You want to tell us a little bit about that? I'd never really heard that or thought about that before, and it got me thinking.
Yeah, I know that was challenging for a number of folks. It was challenging for me to think about as well, as I was kind of contemplating last week this idea, again, that everything we have belongs to God, and we're stewards of that. So the guy with 5 bags of gold, or 5 talents in another way of telling it, realizes that what he has belongs to God. It's the master's in a sense. So it belongs to the master, it belongs to the king. And so he takes that and he multiplies it by taking a risk for God with what God has given him. So he puts it to use. The guy with 2 does the same thing, same result. The guy with 1 decides to hide it. He decides to bury it because he's afraid of the master's response should he risk it and lose it, right? But what all 3 servants recognize, and this is where sometimes even the man who was just entrusted with 1 bag of gold or 1 talent, where he has 1 up on me and sometimes 1 up on many of us, is that he fully realized the 1 that he'd been given, the 1 bag that he'd been given, did not belong to him. It was the master's. So all three of these servants realize full well that what they have been given or what they have belongs to the master. It's his.
Yeah.
It's not theirs. They know that. And so, sometimes I believe that even the faithless servant, because we got two faithful servants, they're faithful in putting to use the things that the master gave them. And then we have this faithless servant who buries the thing that the master gave him. All three of them realize that this is not mine. It's not mine. And the third was just afraid of the consequences. He was afraid to risk. He was afraid to go out there and maybe put at risk what was the master's for fear of losing it, for fear of how the master would react about that. But what God is trying to say about himself is, I'm a master who's given you things, and I expect you to risk and let me take care of the results, right? So you take the risk, I'll take care of the results in a sense. But again, sometimes we fall short of recognizing, I know it's true for me, I fall short of realizing, acknowledging that everything I have, that what I have is God's.
Yeah.
So again, he was one step forward in that. Now it was, in a sense, he had, you could say he had the right understanding, but poor application.
Yeah.
So the right understanding, poor application, but sometimes I'm not, maybe we're not, that's maybe a fear that I have, to the place of even embracing the right understanding, which is
I think you're right.
Is God's.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point to draw from that story. And you made the point in the sermon yesterday, and maybe just a little bit of a disclaimer if you didn't hear it, that there's a lot of points to get from that sermon, a lot of stuff from that parable that Jesus was trying to convey. But at a baseline, I think that's a really good point. And I do think you're right that we miss that often. Yeah. And we don't realize that everything we have is a gift from God. I mean, especially, I just think of where we live, of being, first off, you can say on a larger scale, just being in the United States. Right. But for those of us who are in the Forsyth County area here at Grace Chapel, we live in a pretty wealthy, affluent area in general. And
I think per capita right now, the latest census, the wealthiest county in Georgia.
Yeah. It's so easy that you see so many people around you who can all afford to go and buy a $5 Starbucks on a regular basis. I'm speaking to myself here. And that it's so easy to take that for granted and to think that, no, this is my money. I can spend this however I want. That it's just when we're so surrounded by so many people who are also in that same position, who are also maybe a little bit more affluent, and just in the country that we live in. If you're in the United States, we're in some of the top % of people in the world,
no doubt,
income-wise, and it's just, I think it's a really helpful point. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, it does. We've got this idea conveyed that in that parable, in particular, in the end, what happens is. So you've got the guy with 5 and the guy with 2, the guy with 5 bags of gold, the guy with 2 bags of gold. They both embrace this idea that everything I have belongs to God. Then they also embrace faithfulness. And out of that, they actually are entrusted with more because of the fact that they embraced first the understanding that everything I have belongs to God. Then the second, a faithful response to understanding that everything they have belongs to God, and then they are given more. And in fact, the one who did not embrace faithfulness but still understood that this belongs to my master, actually what he had was taken and given to the one who had been faithful, the one who had 5 bags of gold. It was taken and given to him. And so here's this reality that we are called to faithfulness in the way we steward the things that God has given us, with a promise that if we're faithful, it's almost this idea too that, when we've been given much, so to whom much is entrusted, much will be required, and it's an obvious truism about the way that God engages with us, that if God blesses us with a lot, he asks a lot of us in return, but we also have a ton of opportunity. And so you think about just our area in particular, we are blessed with a lot of financial resources here at our particular church within this area. And that's true of many churches in the United States. The question is then, how do we turn around and faithfully steward those resources in a way that acknowledges that God is the source. So we call them resources, right? So we're just resourcing what God has given us in a sense. So God is the source of these things. Now we're the resource of it. So we get to be the conduit through whom God's grace flows to others. I think about a couple of the other verses that we connected with, or one of the verses in particular we connected with yesterday. The verse from 1 Peter 4:10 that actually then connects with Acts 4. So I'm talking about being, the ones who administer God's grace in its various forms. That is what Peter says, that we who have been gifted by God with different things. Peter actually talks about in that passage, I think, service and maybe in hospitality. He talks about speaking gifts and other things. So we've got these gifts that God has given us, and we now get to turn around, and as we use those gifts, we are administering God's grace in its various forms. Think back to what we started with in Acts 4 in the first message of this series, this idea that there was this community of believers who was living in a way that reflected this knowledge, this understanding that everything they had was from God, so they did incredibly crazy things with what they had been given by God. I mean, even selling houses and property and other things so that there would be no one needy. But what Luke says about that in the summary statement at the end of Acts 4 is that God's grace was so powerfully at work either in or among them, depending on how you translate that. And it doesn't really matter in the way, the result is the same. God's grace was so powerfully at work because the Holy Spirit was moving in them and had given them this proper understanding. And that proper understanding also led to a right way of living. They were just blessing people because they realized, I'm a conduit for God's blessing as I go.
Yeah.
Really, truly a powerful idea.
That's awesome. So Paul, as we kind of land the plane here, give us just like, what's a practical step that we can take, a little application out of this as we kind of like, if we do embrace this reality, that everything we have belongs to God. It's all a gift from Him. It all belongs to Him ultimately. Of how does that change the way we live? What is an application out of that?
Yeah, and that's a really fair question, and it's a tougher one because I think, as I said, sometimes even with that parable in Matthew 25, we want to jump straight to the application. And again, but I said there's two things I think that are substantive or even basic in that. The first is actually understanding, knowing, acknowledging that everything we have is from God. And then the second is, how do we faithfully now live into that knowledge, that understanding? So that's a big deal. And here's what I'm going to say. I think many of us probably need to start at step one with this one.
Yeah.
Because I think we have such a struggle. Let me break it down this way real quick. Okay, so let's just use the three ideas of time, talent, and treasure. Let's say we acknowledge that all of our time is from God. Okay, every moment. I talked about that yesterday in the message. So every moment, so every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year, all of it. So however we want to count time, we look at that and we acknowledge all of that is a gift from God. And I think most of us as believers, we could jump to that level pretty quickly. We couldn't be here, we couldn't exist without God. We acknowledge that piece. Okay, so then let's jump to the next one. We'll say talent, so our abilities. I think we can accept that one pretty readily as well, right? So if you have a gifting and ability, whether it's natural, or we talked a little bit about spiritual giftings yesterday too, if there's something that you've developed since you've given your life to Christ, and so you say, well, that's a spiritual gifting. So whether you have a natural talent or a spiritual gift or talent, however that works out, even those I think we could accept, yes, anything that I have, any ability that I have, comes from God. And even if I've worked on it to make it better, to hone that skill, that craft, it's only because I had the time, which was also from God, to be able to sit down and dedicate to that. So yes, these things in combination now, I can agree that these things are from God. Where we start to push back a little bit is on the point of treasure.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Right? So we talked even last week about going out and grabbing coffee and then looking at your bank statement every now and then and realizing Starbucks here, Starbucks there, Starbucks. I could do the same thing with my bank account, especially a few years ago. I love to fish, and so when we lived in Florida, I could have looked back at my bank account and I would have seen fishing rod here, fishing reel here, fishing trip there. All these different places that I was taking my treasure and throwing it after that hobby of fishing, really enjoying to do that. So I think all of us can find a place. It could be something shopping that you enjoy to do. It could be traveling that you want to do, and all these different things that could be good things. But we have to stop and ask a question: Is it the right thing? So it's a good thing, but is it the right thing? Okay, so that's where we start to push back a little bit, because we do, and I have felt this way, somewhat entitled at times. Man, I work hard. I pour a lot of time and effort into the work that I do, and so the work that I do, I receive compensation for it. That compensation means that I earned it and that I'm entitled to it to some degree, and so we can go there pretty quickly, but it doesn't work out very well for us if, again, we go back to first understanding that every moment that I have is from God, so my time is from God. The ability that I have, which gives me the ability then to do the work that I do and to do it well, is also from God. So if the time that I have to do the work that I do and the gifting that I have to do the work that I do, if that's all from God, then the reward that I get from the work that I do belongs to me.
Yeah.
That's where things start to break down, right? And so it becomes a little bit more difficult there if we don't acknowledge as well. No, it becomes really difficult.
Yeah.
If we're at a place where we don't acknowledge that even my treasure, my finances, my pocketbook, my bank statement, even all that belongs to God. And so I would say for us, a piece of application, don't rush to the second application in this parable or the second basic truth we should grab a hold of out of this parable. Sit in that first one for a little bit, potentially, which again is just acknowledging, because even the faithless servant acknowledged that everything he had was from God, and he still was faithless.
Yeah.
So we need to first sit in that and acknowledge that everything I have is from God. So I think it begins with this question, I think to some degree, is, do I believe that everything I have, even the things I'd be tempted to think I've earned, do I believe at a core level that those things actually belong to God? And if the answer is no, or I really wrestle with that, then sit there for a while.
Yeah.
Sit there for a while. And then if you do accept that, then go ahead and proceed to the second basic truth of this parable, is that then we've been called to act faithfully. And so I think as opposed to giving one practical takeaway, I'd like to leave our listeners with two questions.
Okay.
First, do you believe that everything you have ultimately belongs to God? Do you believe that? And then second, God, if I believe that, how do I live that out faithfully? And here's where it gets real practical. It does. Because the next time you have a big purchase to make, even though it's super uncomfortable, you go to God and you ask the question, God, is this the right thing? And instead of just rushing into that, take a step back and ask that question. Allow yourself to spend some time there. And I think the same is true about the way we spend our time. Asking God, is this something I should be doing? It's interesting, James, we did a series on James just recently, the past few months. James actually says that we should not say, here's what I'm about to go do. In fact, James says when we do that's a measure of arrogance that we're embracing. Yeah. Instead, we should say, if the Lord wills. Why? Well, because I think James understood plainly that even my time belongs to God. The same thing with my talent. God, is this something with my ability that I'm being called into? Should I do this? So asking that question and sitting at that place. Again, so I think the two questions, just first, this idea that do I believe that everything I have is ultimately from God? And then two, how do I take what God has given me and now use it faithfully?
Yeah.
So be at that place where you sit with those two questions, and I guarantee if you answer those two questions, it's going to lead you to your own practical application.
That's awesome. I love that. That's really good. Hopefully you can take some time to do that. Maybe journal those. Write that down. Journal out your answer. Or pull away a little bit of time this week. Maybe you have some time off work and can spend a little bit of time. If you're sitting out at the beach like me or something, just spend a little bit of time, journal, write down those answers. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. I know this is a week where we reflect on the things that we're thankful for.
Yeah.
We do. And so
quite fitting message to kind of go along with that.
It connects. It really does. And so as you're reflecting upon the things that you're thankful for, this is a great time to take stock of ourselves. So here are all these blessings that I'm thankful for: family relationships, financial blessings, the job that you have, whatever it happens to be. Take stock and allow those two questions to be a part of that.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Hope you all have a great week with whatever you got going on for Thanksgiving. Enjoy that, and we'll see you again next week.
Yeah, God bless you all. We'll see you then.